Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our series from the 2014 Canada's Tournament. In round 10, we're going to be watching a match between Kramnik playing the white pieces, Peter Svidler playing the black pieces. Chose this match because not too many matches long ago we saw Peter Svidler play black, the Dutch defense. In this particular game, we saw him play the same, and so usually player will have an unusual opening. He'll find a flaw in his opponent, and he goes after. Peter Svidler actually had a flaw in his own, went back to the drawing board, figured out how he could actually improve on his line, came back to this game and said, I want to give it another shot. So anytime someone's playing an unusual opening at a high level play, I like to do commentary. Doesn't matter if it's a win, lose, or draw to me. I think it's always interesting to see something a little bit different. So that's what we're going to be going over today, so hopefully you guys enjoy. We'll continue with this with knight to f3. Pretty interesting. Knight to f6. Pawn to e3. We usually see something a little bit different, but okay, this is kind of blocking in this dark square bishop. Not as aggressive as white usually is. But then we see pawn here to b6. Very, very different from Peter Svidler. Last time he played the Dutch defense, he didn't move any of these 6 pieces right here for the first 13 moves. So to see him already on move 3, playing pawn here to b6, getting ready to fianchetto to his bishop, trying to control these light squares along this diagonal is definitely something different. My guess is kind of what he's been thinking at night about playing for some time now. White now plays pawn here to d5. Don't mind this at all, kind of blocking off once the bishop comes here to b7, this control of this long file. White does need to have some protectors on it. Could always play pawn here to c4 if you wanted to, knight to c3. Bishop to c4, don't see it that often because it kind of blocks off the control of this long diagonal, but that's actually what we see in this particular game. Kramnik plays bishop here to c4, really wants to tie up the centers because this bishop here on b7 is very nicely placed for black. Now we see pawn here to c6, trying to break up this. Black is looking to castle on the king side later on, so he has no problem just blowing up his queen side so he can get some active pieces on the board. We see knight to c3 and then the exchange. This now opens up for a semi-open file here on the c file, so black will eventually definitely want to get his rook over here to c8 so he can control this file. On the flip side, white now has a semi-open file on the d file, so he's eventually going to be looking to bring his rook over here to d1 so he can kind of control this. Again, rooks really optimized if you can get them in open space, controlling long files, supporting your pieces, especially in the center of the board. C, D, E, and F files, those are really going to be where the rooks are most effective. We now see pawn pushing forward with e6. Doesn't really matter about the pawn chain. The light square bishop is over here. It doesn't have to come through this pawn chain. And it does open up the door for the black square bishop right here to go ahead and get involved, castle on the king side, and complete his development. That's exactly what both sides are looking to do. Doesn't seem like anything crazy is going to happen in this game. We see the knight come over here, take this piece. The queen's going to come into f6. So both sides are probably from here, since there's no huge weaknesses, continue developing pieces and go ahead and castle both sides. This queen here on f6 though does pose a threat on this pawn here to b2. If in fact this bishop ever decides to move, the queen can actually just come in here and take this pawn. The next move is king castle on the king side, which is kind of what we expect. We see bishop here to c5. Again, getting the pieces involved into the action. This is, again, controlling the center of the board, opening up the door for castles. This is definitely going to be good for black. Now we see bishop here to d2. I think this is a pretty big mistake. I think in this particular case, Peter Svidler should just snap, high-five his neighbor, and take right here on b2. Now from here you could see the knight come to d4, trying to block off where this queen can move to. It is kind of blocked off here, so the next move could be rook here to b1, pretty much winning some material here eventually. But from here we could just see the queen to a3, and now it can easily get outside. The bishop could take if he wants to, and the queen can move if for some reason white tries to trap this. In the particular game, black decided not to go ahead and take this material, which I think is questionable at best, and decided to just play knight to c6. Now this is a much safer route. It does develop his pieces towards the center of the board. That's exactly what black wants to do. But again, Peter Svidler has probably not played, in my opinion, the tournament that he wanted to. One of the favorites coming into this tournament. So last time he played the Dutch defense, he actually got a loss. In this particular game, more than likely, he's probably want to try to get a win as the black pieces. And when you play the Dutch defense, you're trying to get your opponent off guard, and that's kind of what he did. And so playing somewhat passive and not gobbling up material when he had the opportunity, I think is definitely a huge miss in this particular game. But alas, we continue. The bishop here to c3, threatening. Both the bishops are eyeing down on the king side. Both the bishops for black are eyeing down on the king side. So eventually we're definitely going to have some fireworks from both sides. We see the queen come up here to e7. Again, it's being attacked. It's also protecting this pawn here on g7. Not too many other options that black had. Pawn here to a3. Trying to lock down this b4 square. He's already kind of locked down this square here on d4, so the knight can't really get involved. So this knight here on c6 is going to be hanging out for a while, depending on what his opponent does. Now we see pawn here to a5, just making sure that his opponent doesn't push further on the queen side. Queen here to e2, completing development, and then king castling on the king side for black. Both sides have now completed development. Again, we're going to be talking about what both sides should do. White's probably going to get his rook over here to d1, controlling this long semi-open file. Black's going to want to bring his rook over here to c8. Both sides are going to try to look for a small advantage that they can get. This pawn here on d7 is protecting this somewhat weak square here on e6 that's kind of being pinned down to the king. So if this pawn moves, look for this pawn here to be somewhat weakness for black. So just a few things to keep in mind. White decides to go ahead immediately and take this square here on d1. Pawn pushes forward with d5, and again, this does a few things. It does control the center of the board. It forces this bishop away, but again, we do have a weakness here on e6. But White's definitely going to have a difficult time actually attacking it and exploiting this defense. As far as being pinned down, now that the pawn's here on d5, White's not going to be able to do too much with his bishops. This king's pretty much safe right here on g8. Bishop now comes here to b5, attacking. The knight swings back, not ready to go ahead and exchange. Pawn to a4, pushing forward a little bit. Bishop back here to d6. White's pushing the pressure a little bit. Black's just playing somewhat defensive. Kramnik decides he wants to go ahead and exchange. Black's not ready yet, but we do see an exchange right here. Pawn pushing forward here to b3, opening up for the bishop to come back here. He still wants to control this long file. White definitely has a much better bishop on the board than black does in this particular game. And then Peter Svidler plays queen here to a6. Pretty questionable move in my opinion. This pretty much says that he wants to go ahead and play for a draw. If the queens were to come off the board, this would definitely be a drawish game. Both sides have a dark square bishop. They have the same amount of material. So in this particular game, I was definitely hoping that White did not take this. And that's exactly what Kramnik did. Again, Kramnik probably hadn't had his favorite tournament of all time either. So if he can actually come out with a win, that would be a huge boost in his confidence going forward for the last few rounds in this tournament. So decides to play queen here to d2. He says no trade for you, sir. Rook over here to c8, again protecting and controlling these long semi-open files. That's usually what we're going to see from these rooks. Now knight here to g5, attacking this weakened square here on e6 as we talked about. So black decides to bring his rook over and protect that. Bishop now comes back here to b2. There's no real forcing move that White has, so he brings his bishop back to a nice safe square right here. Pawn here to h6, forcing the knight to move back. Then we see bishop here to b4. Nice little outpost, although it is on the side of the board, so it's not as strong as if it was in the center of the board, but forces the pawn pushing forward here to c3, forcing that bishop back. Then we see pawn pushing forward to c4. So Kramnik's definitely forcing the action right now, especially on the queen side of the board. We see an exchange, then the rook swing over here to c1. Now the pawn pushing forward here to b5. The pawn couldn't take because the knight there on c6 would have fallen. So we do see an exchange, and then we see the rook swing up here to c4. So pretty interesting here. We do have these lone pawns over here, but things are definitely getting pretty interesting on both sides of the board. Now the knight's going to swing in here to b4. The knight's now going to swing up here to e5. Positioning a little bit better. It's now has a outpost here with his knight here on d5. The queen's going to come up here to c2, protecting once the knight moves. The queen is now attacking this pawn here on b3. And then the bishop comes here to d6, attacking. It is being protected by the bishop right here. Decides to go ahead and move it. Interesting move. It is protected by the rook and the queen right here, but isn't doing too much. I actually kind of like it here on e5, just because it is protected and it clogs up the center of the board. Now we see the knight come back here to b6, attacking the rook, and then the rook makes the fatal error in the game. A lot of different options that white had in this particular case. Just didn't have to play this rook here to d4. And this is bad because there's now a deflection that black can do, and that is the bishop taking here on h2. This queen on the board was attacking not only the rook, but the rook down here. After the king is forced to move and take, the queen can come down here on f1, capture this material, and then it's just all downhill from here. Anytime you're up material this late in the game and you have both of your rooks and your queen on the board, it's going to be very, very difficult for your opponent to come back from this. White does play his last ditch effort. He plays queen here to c3. His threat is pretty much the rook coming down here to d1, attacking the queen. The queen would pretty much fall because then the queen is also threatening coming up here to g7 and checkmate. Black's not going to let that happen, obviously, so he plays the rook here to f6, stopping that attack. The queen, again, obviously could not take with his queen here on f2, because once the rook were to come here to f4, that would be good game. The queen would either fall, or again, the queen could just take here on g7. But it's not as bad if the rook instead first comes here to f6, blocking that threat off. Now when the knight comes here to e5, black is okay to go ahead and gobble up this material here on f2. Now when the rook swings over, we're going to see the queen come back here to e2, centralize. Again, black is just now gobbling up material. He's up 2 pawns of material just on the pawn front, and he's up 2 points of material off his rook over the bishop piece that his opponent has. So now queen here to d4, nice little outpost move with the knight here on d5. Again, this weakness here that black had on e6, white was just never able to really attack this, and it became a pretty huge strength from black as he had this pawn here on f5 that he had from the very beginning of the game from the Dutch defense. This has proved very, very valuable, and this has also proved for a nice little outpost for many of his pieces in this game. Rook now swings back here to f3, and then the rook's going to swing over here to c8. Again, now it's an open file, can easily get involved into the action, even coming down here to c2. Anytime you can get your rooks on the second file, it's going to be very good, especially have your queen there as well. Now the rook over here to g3, the pawn pushing forward here to f4, and then in this particular case, Kramnik was forced to resign. There's just no real good way to attack this. The pawn could take, the rook swings down here. Black is just up too much material. He can easily get his other rook involved into the game. White just doesn't have any real threats, and his king is just too exposed. This is going to be a pretty easy endgame for black to play. So luckily for Peter Svidler, he actually was able to win with the Dutch defense. Definitely the win that he needed going into the last 3 matches of this tournament. So hopefully you guys enjoyed watching. Always find it interesting when someone plays something unusual like the Dutch defense. So hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.